Good evening, or perhaps good morning would be a more appropriate greeting. Midnight Movies faithful. My name is Scott Foundas. I'm the Associate Program Director of the Film Society and a member of the New York Film Festival Selection Committee. We're very happy to welcome you all to our first official screening in our newly inaugurated Midnight Movies section here at the New York Film Festival. And we really couldn't have a better way to kick it off than with the movie you're about to see. I think I don't really want to say much about it because it's full of surprises. I'll just say, Psycho was famous as this movie that made people afraid to go into the shower, and Jaws was a movie that made people afraid to go into the ocean. This is just sort of a movie that will make you afraid of water, period. End of story. And it comes from a filmmaker that can only be described as one of the great storytellers in American movies. He's the Oscar-winning director of Diner, Rain Man, Avalon, Good Morning Vietnam, Bugsy, Disclosure, Wag the Dog. The list goes on and on. It's a great pleasure to welcome him to the New York Film Festival. Please give a warm welcome to Barry Levinson.
Thank you. Thanks. It's, it's funny because before you go in, you keep wondering if anyone will show up, and I keep picturing like 7 people in pajamas here. So it's nice that we have a little gathering. I'm just going to tell you a couple of things. There'll be a Q&A afterwards, and there'll be more to talk about then. This originally started because I come from Baltimore, so I'm approached by various Baltimore things, and someone asked me if I would do a documentary about the Chesapeake Bay because it's 40% dead. And I thought about it, and we started to collect information on it. And then I came across that Frontline had done a documentary on the Chesapeake Bay and really addressed a number of the issues. And the discouraging thing is that there was very little outcry that this largest estuary in the United States, in fact, was 40% dead. But the facts of it all were so kind of frightening to me. It stayed with me, and a few weeks later I began to think of the idea of what happens if you tell a story, a theatrical piece, and apply that 85% of this factual information. Obviously we have to invent a fake scenario, but we put 85% of actual facts into it, which in a sense become rather unnerving and frightening as the piece continues. So I just mentioned that as that is the genesis of how this came about. And we can talk more about it, but just give you a little preface to it all. So thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll talk afterwards. Thank you.
Please welcome back Barry Levinson. So let me start by asking just about the style of the film in a way, because we've seen other horror movies done in a quote unquote documentary style, but almost always they're kind of a single source, somebody
Right.
making a home movie or scientific video or something like that. And this movie is constantly changing. Surveillance video, home movies, news footage, camcorders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did you, start to think of it in those terms and talk about then actually executing it that way?
Well, once the idea that something happened in one particular town, and there needed to be an investigation, this is pretty much part of our lives now, because everybody has cell phones, video cameras, everybody's texting, tweeting, they're doing everything. And so if you were to gather that, you can get a picture of what's going on in a 24-hour period. It would never have happened before, but only in these last years that this kind of way that you can begin to document in sort of like an archaeological dig, a modern one at that, but a way to examine what happened in a community in a given day. And so that's what kicks it off, as opposed to somebody had a camera. That's why there's all this different kind of digital usage throughout the film.
And can you talk about how you worked with your cinematographer sort of to achieve the look? I mean, one of the things I really liked looking at it again is just that you sort of always respect the rules of whatever the medium is. So if we're looking at a security camera, we don't see anything that
Right.
camera couldn't conceivably see or go anywhere that it couldn't go.
Josh, the cinematographer, Josh Nussbaum, is here someplace, and we did a terrific job. And what we did was we experimented with all the digital platforms that were out there in advance, and we went through them and say, well, which ones would work for us? Because we never went to the high-end stuff. We didn't use a red camera or anything even better than that. So everything we're using is almost, maybe a D5 is almost at the top of the pyramid in terms of quality. Everything else was, less than that. So we needed to figure out which ones we would use throughout the course of it. And then we did have to, you had to honor with, look, it's a movie, so we're not going to fake people out. But within it, you had to keep the credibility. So if you take the two kids down by the water in the dock, how do you tell that story with one camera without coverage? So he was filming her, she gets bored, she takes the camera from him, we now see him, she's going on the dock, he takes the camera from her, then she jumps into the water, he's videoing her, then he sees something is wrong, then he jumps into the water, and the camera gets loose, and then you see these extra little few shots. So you have to make it work that way without any other angle. So you had to figure out the design, or if you say the squad car responding to a 9/11, they're going down the street, and we start about 4 blocks away. And it keeps coming, and then eventually gets to the location, and then the guys get out, then they come around, now they're back into the surveillance camera from the squad car, and the scene plays out in front of it. So there are no cuts. It all has to be done in one. So you have to figure out the choreography of it and how to create the credibility so you don't begin to tear the fabric of our sort of artificial credibility.
Talk a little bit about the science in the film, because you said at the beginning that this is true that 40% of the Chesapeake Bay is dead.
Yeah.
How much of the other things in the film come from the world of real science?
Well, I mean, there are isopods that did start in the Pacific, now in the Atlantic. In fact, in the movie, when you see him pulling it and he's showing it up with the tweezers, he said, "This is an isopod." That was a real isopod, which we were in South Carolina, and we just pulled it off the fish. So that one, you just had to take the fish and hold it up and do it, and that's for real. So they are in this very small thing, which are referred to as sea lice, and they do evolve to these larger sizes that you see. And the one that we showed that's like 2.5 feet long, and he says, "Well, that doesn't look real." That is real. That is off the Google site, and it did try to burrow itself into the side of a submarine. So that is real. So that's why we tried to add to it. So, sometimes we go, "Oh, well, that can't be real." So we try to even make a bigger point of it. And when we Google, and if you leave here, and if you Google videos, you'll see, Google pictures, you will see all of the things which were shown on the website, that those isopods in all of its various forms exist. And they're in the Pacific, they're in the Atlantic. They haven't actually gone into, as we say, into brackish water, but because the Chesapeake Bay is a toxic soup, who knows what jump you will take. So a lot of things, even when the guy is saying that, well, there was a nuclear reactor leakage in 2002 and it's making its way into the bay, it'll take that. That's a factual piece of information. Mike Wallach is also here, the writer who had all of this kind of factual stuff that he collected that we've put into the piece that is for real. The Chesapeake Bay was, at one point, was able to self-clean itself every 4 days because it was grass bottom and all the oysters. It could self-clean itself every 4 days, but there is no longer any grass. And so the oyster beds are almost gone. So that's why it's at a 40% pollution right now. And unless something is to happen, it's easy to tip over and you're into 60, 65, and who knows where that goes. When they mentioned the thing in the movie, the CDC is looking at some footage that's 2 years old of this Vibrio, of the kid who put his foot in the water and he was dead within 24 hours. That is in fact true. That's actually real footage. There are those kinds of viruses in the water. That's not like thousands of people will get it, but those cases do in fact exist. So we play fast and loose in reality in terms of the health of the Chesapeake Bay. I can't sit here and do, as I say, I'm not doing a documentary, even that was where I was originally approached. I'm trying to create a theatrical experience that we can be involved in, get caught up in the story, get caught up in the characters, and carry this information with it. And hopefully it supports the movie and creates a certain, tension for the audience.
And I'm just wondering what the experience was like for you to make a film like this, coming, really from a long career of making much larger films with that, with the sort of armature that comes with making a studio film.
Well, it was the fun of it in a way. We made it for, a little under $2.5 million. We shot it in 18 days, and that's with underwater sequences and out on boats and everything else. So logistically, it was complicated. It was fun in a sense that you have a certain amount of freedom. And we had to figure out, a lot of times the actors actually had to shoot the scenes themselves. And so there was this mixed bag of where, Josh is running with the camera, and then suddenly you got some kid with a camera and all of that to try to all mesh it together so that everything seems seamless, even though we may be doing, more of the shooting. And you wanted to, you have to have a sort of a controlled freedom, but maybe even more freedom than I might normally do, because if you take the young girl with the iPhone, she was a day player, and we sent her into the bathroom and just say, here, talk about this, and she talked, but there's no link, so we can't see. Mm-hmm. So after I come knock on the door and say, okay, stop, and then she'd come out and take the iPhone and then look at the footage and see how she shot it and how well she showed the boils, et cetera, and you go, all right, it's good. If you do it one more time, maybe you can try this, and send her back into the room. There was one thing where there's this 15-year-old, and she was a day player, and I thought she was interesting. And I said, I'd like to use you in another scene. And she didn't seem that receptive. And I said, well, what's wrong? She says, well, I'm going to need a note for school in order to get out for the day. So we had to write a note, please excuse so-and-so as she's filming the bay. So.
I want to take some questions from the audience for Barry. Right here in the front. You have seen the Romney 47% video, haven't you?
That's part of the, what goes on. You don't have to go much further than Katrina to see the bureaucracy of what happened and what went wrong, and we can track a bunch of those things. Unfortunately, some of these agencies do not share information and aren't coordinated as well as they should be, and a lot of the information that guy at the very end is saying is based on conversations that Mike had in the collection of how would they go about it and how would they deal with it. So it was as close to, as I say, to what we could possibly get in terms of some of those bureaucracies. That the EPA doesn't actually monitor some of the things you think they do, and supposedly that's outside of their domain. And the water supplies, when you do look at a lot of these different graphs, are D- in terms of water filtration. Which may be surprising, but we also know bridges are falling down and they're D-, et cetera. So those are just factual things thrown through the movie. We weren't, making those up.
Other questions? Yes.
Just this, I'm sorry, this is more of a comment, but nobody else is raising their hand. As a person from the Delmarva Peninsula, I see, like when he said there was 85% fact, that's true, and that's really scary to see, because granted, hopefully we'll never have a flesh-eating insectopod, but everything in there was very real, and I was very impressed. It was
Thank you.
incredible. Like, just as a person from that area.
From that area, yeah. Look, the reality is, in order to correct the situation, we don't have to invent things that we don't know. And it's not like it's an unknown. We know exactly what's contributing to that extensive pollution. It can all be corrected. We understand the economics of it, and we understand the environmental side. But unfortunately, there isn't enough interaction and enough working towards a common cause to correct it, without putting thousands of people out of jobs. There are answers to this, but the answer we most rely on is, let's just push it down the road and not deal with it today. So, it's unfortunate, but that's a reality, and if you're from that area, you understand that.
Yes, sir.
Thinking about that statistic about how much of this is true, it made me wonder, what was your impetus for making this film? Was it more from an entertainment standpoint or a muckraker sort of thing? What prompted you to make this?
Well, as I said, when I started, I was approached in terms of a documentary and didn't think that was the best way to deal with it. So I began to think of it as a movie, so which means it's going to be, characters and stories and things we have to follow, and just tried to back it up with this as opposed to, be playing in a totally fake world of, say, zombie things, etc., which is not something I know. So I didn't set out to try to make, what you might consider a horror type of film. I was just following the direction. If you start here, this is where you can end up. So the fact that there is information makes for talk. We can talk about it. Ultimately, you got to sit and enjoy a movie, and if there's other things to talk about afterwards, that's great. And if something happens that's beneficial from that, that's terrific.
Yes, here.
I was just wondering, and I know you said you started off wanting to create this documentary. Is just from that's how you stemmed this kind of idea of the video surveillance and the iPhone, and then this whole you said 24-hour surveillance kind of thing, or is that just a way to convey this feeling that the audience then very much understands?
Well, I mean, it's an investigation, and the investigation, would take place. As I've said, it's like an archaeological dig, except it's all a digital dig in a sense, because all of that stuff is out there. So the found footage forum I look at over here. This is probably a way, if we were to examine how we lived in 2000, in these years, we would get an idea of our sense of humor, how we communicated. What did we look like? How did we act? How do we behave? How do we dress? This documentation is around us all the time. And this is the beginning, probably the first time that's really come about, that much is included in our daily lives. Because you look at people with video, they got something making coffee in the morning, talking about something. I mean, really it's simple stuff. So it seemed like an interesting way to use it and expand upon it. And, tell a story, that we can get involved in. And it was just a different form.
Yes, there.
This movie was awesome. I thought it was great. I was curious, how did you get Jason Blum involved?
A question about how Jason Blum became involved.
When we finally got a script, we approached him on it, and he was, very enthusiastic, and it moved very quickly after that.
And what about Oren Peli, the producer we know from the Paranormal Activity?
I never met
franchise?
him directly, because Jason was basically the front man on that particular piece. So I really had the conversations with him and not with Oren directly in that regard.
I think we maybe have time for one or two more. Yes, here. A question about how much CGI, if any, is in the film.
The CGI would be in different spots. Like, for instance, when the isopod comes out of the fish's mouth and grabs the guy's hand, that's CGI in there. And we do a combination periodically in terms of when there's in some shots, like the person's face is being partially eaten away and it's CGI. The woman at the end, when she's there and the thing comes out of her mouth, is CGI. So it's placed in a few other invisible spots that I don't even think you can pick up on. But they really had to work to make that as credible as possible. Otherwise, it sort of blows the whole thing if you go, oh, that's, that looks silly, like hand puppetry or something, So we didn't do a lot of it, but where we did place it, it became very important for us.
Yeah, in the center there, yes.
Yes, you're not, as you said, you got experience in zombie movies and so on. Did you find it difficult to work in a
Well, I mean, I think the challenge of pushing yourself out of your own comfort zone, I think, is always worthwhile. I mean, I've tried to move outside of what I'm supposedly, doing. In other words, if I was doing diner and those type of things, I did still go in other directions. So I like to be challenged by moving outside of what I'm comfortable with and then using totally different, technology, which has only really been happening in the last years, that you can now play with everything. I mean, even some of these digital images that we had, as well as they hold up, we actually had to go in the DI suite and sort of degrade it a little bit because it almost looked too real, or too professional in a way. So we actually had to tweak some of it. So to be able to play with all of this new technology to tell a story was really exciting, and it was challenging to us as to how do we do this, how much shake do we do, how little do we do. If a kid was doing it in that way, and then if we were going to do it, then we needed to mimic that in a way, so that therefore sometimes, if you look carefully, there's a finger on the lens in the left-hand quarter, and that might have been Josh doing it as opposed to a kid. So we needed to find everything to give us as much credibility and authenticity, even though we all know it's a movie. So it was an interesting experience, and for me it was exciting. It makes it fun.
Over here.
Yeah, just after watching the film, I noticed how it seemed that everyone in the town, most everyone who came into contact with either the organism or people who were infected with it died, and obviously Donna survives this whole scenario. And it's kind of a two-part question in the sense that what made you decide to tell the story basically from the end with her beginning and bringing you through the story rather than actually doing like a real time from the beginning, encountering each of the events as they went, rather than someone at the end bringing you through.
In a sense of way to kind of fill in some things and explore some stuff, and so we didn't have to do certain kinds of things where we would have to explain it in another way, as opposed to one of the people that felt a certain degree of guilt of being inadequate at the time to really tell the story, so it never got out properly. She thought it was a murder, etc., and to allow her to be a little bit more of a guide to it, as opposed to just leave it open-ended and let us figure it in, because it's got enough elements running all over the place that we thought we just needed to ground it a little bit of someone that lived through it, who's trying to tell you what happened, and still, even looking at it now, it's not easy, and it has an emotional chord that affects her.
Could you see yourself doing another film this way, not necessarily a horror film, but a kind of DIY film?
I think so. I would modify its form in a way, but I could continue to play with a lot of this new digital technology, so that that I think it just opens the door to other things. It's not to say that it needs to be real, but there's something in it that I think will continue to evolve way past even where we are now. I liken it to when the music synthesizer came about. It was trying to make the sound of, say, a flute or a sound of a violin. It was trying to copy it. And then as it evolved, it created sounds that were totally brand new. And I think that's what's going to happen with a lot of this digital stuff. It won't just try to mimic what film was doing. Yeah. It will go somewhere else and create another visual palette that none of us may even understand at this point.
Barry Levinson, thank you so much for letting us have the bay to
Thanks for coming.
christen our midnight movie series.